Hello, everyone. Sientir here, and welcome to what'll be my final Patron podcast. More on that at the end of the video. For now, let's go ahead and jump in. And again, the Patron Podcast is a podcast I have run for my patrons on my Patreon at patreon.com/Sientir. And the Patreon is still going to be going on, so you are absolutely invited to go there and check things out. And let's go ahead and jump into the winning topics of this month. We're actually kind of very similar. So the first one is after watching The Kingsman. So both of these are about The Kingsman, which is it's the third movie in the Kingsman series, but it also is a prequel and an origin story. So anyway, continuing on with the topic, do I have any thoughts on war? So The Kingsman is set predominantly during and around World War I. And some of the lead up to that and whatnot, and a little bit of the aftermath. So it talked a lot about it, and it says the topic continues, beginning, end, pacifism, or a movie review. So I'll probably give a slight brief sort of review, but I really want to dig into this main thing, and the other one is, what do I think of an action movie, The Kingsman, having an anti-war message? Is it effective or hypocritical? So these are basically kind of the same sort of thing, and a lot of the bent is The Kingsman, so to give a bit of a rough overview before getting into spoiler territory, is a movie that explains the origin of the Kingsman organization, as you see in the Kingsman movies. And I believe they're based on a comic book, but I'm not positive on that, so take that with a grain of salt. I didn't think to check that before I started recording, and here we are. So the basic premise is that you follow sort of the founder and the founding members of the Kingsman organization and why they made that organization and how everything went. And it involves fictionalized events around World War I, as well as one of the big things and a core motive here is that the sort of founding, original sort of founder guy really wants to stop war from happening because it is awful. And they do a lot to highlight that over the course of the movie. And it has kind of a message of sometimes the only way to stop larger acts of violence is with smaller ones. And it's really interesting, I thought, to see a movie set around World War I. World War II gets all the love because it's more recent, but it also is, I don't want to call it grander, but it's a little bit more archetypal. World War I's messier. You've got messier things going on with sides, with the causes. The villains are a little bit less villainous. World War II has very clear villains. A lot of it is amped up, and it is more black and white. The villains, particularly with the Nazis, are extremely villainous and extremely easy to demonize. And so it makes for easier narratives. And so we've seen a lot more stuff around World War II. So it's really cool from a setting standpoint to have World War I actually show up. And there's a lot of interesting stuff that it plays with those events and whatnot. Although, let's just say it exaggerates things, and this is a work of historical fiction, not trying to be accurate. But as an origin story, it does have a little bit of a problem of sort of wandering a bit. It kind of comes in several discrete sort of chapters, and so it lacks a little bit of cohesion from that standpoint. And the subject matter, it means that the sort of humor levels are not where they were in the previous Kingsman movies. But I nevertheless enjoyed it and overall liked it. So we're going to move into talking about spoiler stuff at this point. And war is horrific. I really found it very interesting, the emphasis this movie had on how horrible war is, how senseless the deaths are with it, particularly with, what is his name? I don't know. It's been a couple of weeks since I watched it. But the main character's son, dying in very senseless fashion. The way tensions rise, everybody's on edge. The valor and bravery of it, maybe, yeah, but you'd kind of rather have the person alive. And um, but it also has, because one of the things you have is the main character uh, was a soldier who then decides to become a pacifist and ends up discovering that, like, well, maybe he has to break that vow of pacifism in order to be able to stop people from doing worse things. And it's a very interesting sort of contrast of, like, sometimes you just have to stop the bad people from doing really bad things because diplomacy doesn't work. Like, they try diplomacy, it doesn't work. The war happens anyway. And that sort of core message of, like, this is an absolute horrific thing. War is an absolutely horrific thing. And I think it's very effective to have a movie like this that does go strong on the violence actually try to carry that message, because they're able to emphasize the horrific nature of it. It's very interesting in that its point in many regards is like, we need to be very careful about glorifying war. We need to be very careful about sort of the propaganda of, like, the valor and the bravery and the heroism that we associate with war, because it brings, like, real traumas and a lot of senseless destruction and violence. And a big point of it, and a central wrestling is that the movie has with the main character, is, when is violence actually justified? Like, you might have a lot of skill and a lot of capability, but fundamentally that's another human being that you're fighting, like an actual conflict. Obviously, fictionalized movies and fictionalized events don't have real human beings in that sense. It's messy when you have, like, live actors and all that, but that's another point entirely. And like, with real war and real conflict, you're looking at, like, human beings dying, and when is taking a life justified? And war has a lot of tendency to, and particularly, one of the things that this train of thought goes into, that was a really interesting contrast, is we have the old soldier, the guy who was a soldier and has retired, and is trying to live a pacifist life, and, like, joins the Red Cross and is trying to do some good, to bring some healing into the world, to try to do something to help instead of hurt. And like, a lot of very noble things. And his son is full of, like, patriotism, and when he hears about the war, he wants to go sign up. He wants to go fight to help his nation, to fight for his nation. And the main character is like, this is the Duke of Oxford, I think, is his title. I don't know why I'm blanking on his name right now, but anyway, his, like, experience is like, yeah, no, it's not that great. It's not that great to go out there and, like, don't believe the propaganda and the way that, you know, the young and inexperienced who don't know what they're talking about, they don't know what that experience is, get whipped up into thinking it's glorious, and it's not. It's horrific. And it really does a great job of, like, taking that mindset, that war glorified mindset, and, like, shoving its face in the horrors of war and the senselessness of it, the violence of it, especially World War I. World War I was, as I understand it historically, was absolutely horrific, with some of the things that were going on with the trench warfare and all of the, like, dead man zones, where, like, they were called that because you went in there and you were a dead man, and all of the, like, grittiness. It's not like, you know, a bunch of people lined up with pikes. Like, these were death zones, bullets whizzing, horrific chemicals were used. Like, it was awful. And the number of dead and the number of people who died from these wars makes it really easy to like have it just be a statistic, and this does a really good job of humanizing that. And so the central conflict between sort of the youth, the teenager, patriotic bravado, and wanting to serve his country, wanting to play his part, and the parent being like, I've been there, it's awful, I don't want you in that, but him ignoring his father's wisdom and all of that. It's just an interesting, like, sort of conflict. And I don't think it's hypocritical. I think it's a good medium for doing it, because a lot of movies that tend to be more actiony, I'm just looking at the prompts here again. A lot of the movies that tend to be more actiony, that tend to be, glorifying violence. Like this is it. It makes me think of Spec Ops: The Line, actually, which is a video game that I'm going to spoil a little bit here. I've not played it myself, but I've heard about what it does, and it is a war shooter that ultimately like has the player following along with what it does, and then sort of pulls back to show you like you've been a villain in the horrific things you've done, and taking that and having it be, this is something where you kind of like, it's in the genre and it's making you take a critical look at what the genre often does and often presents. And so I think it's a very effective place to do it. It's a very effective place to have an anti-war message, because it's the sort of place where it's able to use the mechanisms and the tropes that normally are used to glorify the sort of thing, to act as like almost pro-war propaganda, that sort of like hero propaganda. And it's able to take that and it's able to flip it, and by adjusting the way that we're looking at it, it's able to show like the horrors of war in an incredibly poignant way. And I think that's an incredibly effective thing to do. And you kind of need the language of the action film to be able to really do it. But it also is like an effective place of examining like, well, where is violence appropriate? Where is it the right response? And sometimes, like, if diplomacy fails, what options do you have? And just the messiness of things. So I think that more or less sums up my thoughts on this. I personally would prefer we never have any wars. But I also don't think the answer is to just roll over against people who are aggressors. Sometimes violence is warranted, and sometimes, and it's very difficult to make these sort of moral decisions, and I don't envy people who have to make them, of when is an assassination justified, when is trying to take out somebody fomenting, and it's always more clear-cut in movies where you have like more of a James Bond supervillain sort of thing. You take out the supervillain and the people who are driving things fall away, and that sort of thing is much simpler than real life is most of the time. But you have like, I never want people to have to go fight in wars, but sometimes, and this is one of the things that was also like discussed in there, sometimes you do have to send these young people to their deaths to try to stop an aggressor. And it's difficult to figure out how to balance that, and how do you like find the balance there. And that's something else that the movie also kind of wrestles with. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap up there, I think. I will, however, talk about, I mentioned that this is going to be the final Patron podcast. The reasons for that is simply that I've come to realize that the Patron podcast isn't really serving any sort of distinct purpose. This is going to be episode number 50. If you look at the YouTube playlist, you're going to notice that there are not that many episodes in the playlist. That's because most of them have been audio-only recordings available on my Patreon. Again, that's patreon.com/Sientir. The Patreon continues, but I've been trying to streamline and focus it. And as these have been monthly, you might realize I've been doing this for quite some time. The first one came out in December of 2017, and I've been doing them monthly since then. But as I've realized, the only people who are keeping this going by submitting topics, and most of the people voting on them, are not actually that interested in the Patron podcast itself. And as I've been trying to figure out what it is that I'm specifically doing and streamlining everything, I realized that the Patron podcast doesn't really have a place. It doesn't really have much of a purpose. When I first came up with it, trying to figure out something to provide people that is of value. And the realization that I had is the main thing that I have going on my Patreon that I think is of value are the Dear Patron daily diary entries that I do. And so that's going to be the focus going forward with my Patreon. And that kind of frees stuff up a little bit in terms of mental space. And more importantly, it allows me to present a more streamlined front. So I hope people have enjoyed the Patron podcast, have enjoyed being able to see it. But just going forward, I just realized it didn't really have a place. And frankly, if people are interested in my thoughts on things, they're more than welcome to ask. You can go to my Discord. There's a link down below. You can ask questions there. You can go to my Twitter, twitter.com/Sientir. I'm very consistent. You're welcome to ask questions there. You can go to my Patreon. You can join up. You can ask questions that way. So there's a lot of avenues for people to be able to ask my opinion on things that doesn't require a specific podcast. So I realize it's kind of a bit of a relic, and 50 is a nice round number to end on anyway. So I thank you all for watching, and until next time, everyone, take care and goodbye.